ലിബറേറ്റ് ഫിലോസഫറുടെ ഒരു ടോക്ക് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു സാന്നിധ്യം ലിബറേറ്റിൻ്റെ വേദിയിൽ വരുന്നു എന്നതിലെ സന്തോഷം കൂടി പങ്കുവെച്ചുകൊണ്ട് അദ്ദേഹത്തെ സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. ഇറ്റ്സ് അവർ ഹോണർ ആൻഡ് പ്ലഷർ പ്രിവിലേജ് ടു ഹാവ് യു ഹിയർ സർ. വെൽക്കം. ഇന്നത്തെ ടോക്കിൻ്റെ മോഡറേറ്ററായി ഇവിടെ എത്തിച്ചേർന്നിട്ടുള്ളത് നമ്മുടെയൊക്കെ സുപരിചിതനും KCHI ചെയർപേഴ്സൺ, പ്രമുഖ ചരിത്രകാരനും മാർക്സിസ്റ്റ് ചിന്തകനുമായ KN ഗണേഷ് മാഷാണ്. മാഷിനെയും സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു.
Sorry, sir. I am Ganesh, who's actually supposed to be moderating this session, and I don't want to speak myself now. I think you can proceed with your lecture, Professor Sarukkai. You may proceed with your lecture.
Okay, so I can't see anything on the screen, but you can hear me there, right?
We can hear you.
But you can hear me. I can start?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just let me know if you're not able to hear me clearly, okay?
Okay, please.
Alright, good evening. It's lovely to be here. I hope you can hear me, and it's quite a surreal experience because I can't see anything. The screen is also dark. So yeah, I'm going to presume that I'm audible, and if there is any problem, please call me or stop me. I'm really glad to be part of this event. Thank you, Ranjit, for inviting me for this. I'm also particularly delighted that a subject such as what you are talking about, such as the Liberation Festival, and a more deeper understanding of technology has been undertaken in this festival. So I'm sharing thoughts on this. So I titled the talk as Ghost in the Machine, Technology and Agency, because I wanted to address what I think is one of the most important problems in understanding technology today, which is the real relationship between the people who control technology, the people who use technology, and the very nature of technology. I use the idea of ghost in the machine because it's a very well-known image, which is first used by a philosopher, Gilbert Ryle, and when he is talking about it to critique Descartes, and particularly the mistake which he thinks Descartes makes, which is to distinguish the mind from the body. And this is a very old problem, I think, in the sense that you will see this across many philosophical traditions. And the question is very simple. The question is that what makes an object move? So if I move, when my body moves, am I moving because of something within me which makes the body move? And if I understand human body movement, the movement of the human body, as being driven by insight, something which tells you to move, or whatever that idea is, intention, consciousness, mind, etc., then how do you understand the movement of other bodies, like a stone falling, etc.? This has been one of the foundational questions of all philosophical doctrines, whether it's the Indian, the Chinese, the Greek, and so on. But with Descartes, given his theological background and the influence of that, which makes him produce two different distinctions, two different types of objects, two different types of substances, to say it correctly, which is the mind and the body. And what Descartes is trying to suggest is that the mind controls the body in some sense. So for him, the idea that mind is different from that of the body in some fundamental sense, and that it in some sense controls the movement of the body or whatever else that the body does. And Ryle's argument was that it's a mistake, a fundamental, particular kind of philosophical mistake to do that. And this idea that the mind is functioning like the ghost in the machine. You can't see what the mind is, and yet it is controlling that particular machine, which is the body, is what he called as a ghost in the machine. Because his point was to say that mind depends on the brain, and that there is some kind of this whole questions of materialism and so on. So I'm not going to talk about any of this point. I just want to use that image of ghost in the machine, because the idea of the ghost in the machine is so central to the way we understand technology today. One of the most basic and across, whether it's from children to adults, support for the idea of technology. When people are worried about what is happening with technology, especially now with AI, there's a lot more public talk about it. The first response would be to say, well, technology cannot override humans because we control them. We are the ghost in the machine, inside the machines controlling technology. And therefore, whatever you say about what digital technology is doing, you are eventually going to say, look, don't worry, because the humans are still under control of it. And this is the ghost in the machine I'm trying to use from Ryle to talk about this particular belief about human control over technology. And if Ryle says that Descartes is making a fundamental mistake about distinguishing the mind and the body, I am trying to suggest here that we are making a fundamental mistake when we continue to believe in the myth that there is something called the human which controls this something called technology, and that we cannot have this idea of ghost in the machine of humans controlling technology is a very problematical one, and we should learn to think through it. And that's really, I'm going to make a couple of simple arguments for it, just to open up the space of thinking about technology. And as I said, I'm really delighted that we are actually doing it on such a public platform, and with Chinta and the people who are associated with it, because in India, it's so difficult to have science and technology studies programs. Across the world, even small countries have very well established programs which study the nature of science and technology. There is a completely independent discipline called technology studies, which is very multidisciplinary, draws on many different disciplines to understand the nature of science and nature of technology. But for various reasons, we don't do it here. So in that context, I'm also really glad that we are in this public discussion on this particular topic. Now, interestingly, to come back to this question of the ghost in the machine, the mind-body connection to human technology connection that I'm making is not really that far removed, even for Descartes. Because for Descartes, for him, he looked at the body itself as an automata. Now, what are automata? This was a very important idea, which actually captures many other kinds of things we have seen around us, including human beings and objects around the world. These are actually moving things or self-moving things. In other words, if an object, let's say a rock, if I push a stone, then the stone is moving because I move it. But what about things which seem to move by themselves? And what does this mean? Descartes was very influenced by the kind of instruments he had seen, including clocks. And the clocks has been a great fascination for that particular European time period, post-Renaissance up to Enlightenment and so on, which actually influenced a lot of very fundamental ideas in philosophy too. So you have this very intricate connection of clocks, which is all internal. So in clocks, a lot of things are moving, but it's only the internal mechanism alone. There is nobody sitting inside making them move, and that's the larger understanding of what. So in that particular time, you had gadgets like clocks and mills, floor mills, fountains and so on, and which for somebody like Descartes, who was very influenced by it, he was trying to make sense of how does it move without a driver making them move, without a ghost inside making them move. So therefore he goes to the extent of saying plants and animals, etc., are actually like these clocks and mills and fountains, because they have something internal, and his description of that, you can see how much the idea of technology begins to influence how we understood the body itself. Because when they look at the question of plants and animals and so on, when he talks about animal body, for example, he talks about an entirely mechanistic description, which is he describes all body structures in terms of instruments or technological gadgets. For example, nerves. The animal nerves were seen to be like pipes, muscles were like springs, and and there's a whole hydraulic automata idea. It's all driven by water that drives the machinery and so on, because he wants to remove mind and consciousness from animals, and it's only humans who then have to make sense of how do humans move and so on. You can see there are two very important parallel connections. One, that when things act, so there's a larger question, it's not just about movement. When things act, what makes them act the way they act? For example, when my body acts, when I lift a bottle of water near me to drink water, or I decide to do something, let's say give this talk, which part of the body is actually acting? Is it that we tend to say, oh, it's your mind and consciousness and your intentionality which makes me pick up the bottle or give this talk. But for plants and animals and so on, for Descartes and others, they did not accept that they had mind and consciousness. So this was like a very interesting influence of a whole mechanistic techno picture of the complete universe, actually. And that influences very importantly how the basic ideas of science and physics are themselves developed at that time. But that's a different story. So there is also another parallel which is very important, which is that this understanding of this attempt to try and describe the body in terms of machine-like structures, in terms of technology, points out a fundamental relationship between technology and the body. In fact, all notions of technology are very closely tied, related to the idea of the body. And in fact, as we will see, when the early forms of pre-capitalist and capitalist economies, this also becomes a particular kind of body which gets related to technology. For example, the laboring body, which gets particularly associated with particular forms of technology. So, so I want to come back to this question, therefore, of asking, if technology is acting in a particular way, should we have to assume that something in it is making them act in that particular manner? And this I want to see as a question of agency, because the question of agency is very simple. Who acts? Who is the agent of action? And when I'm asking who acts, I'm talking about the simple thing like when I lift the bottle of water to drink, who is actually acting? You will not say that my hand is acting. You will not say that my eye is acting. It is a kind of a system which acts. But that acts is also not related just to some very simple bodily mechanisms, because there are other kind of ideas which are more problematical, which are more difficult to understand, such as intentionality, that I want to drink and therefore I reach out and pick it up. So this question of action is of course a very important problem in philosophy. There have been many ways of trying to make sense of action, but you can move from the action of the body to asking a more fundamental question which connects to our problem with technology, which is who controls the production as well as the use of technology. So one, we can talk about the very action of the technological gadgets, but then you can extend this question to ask a little broader question: who controls the production as well as the use of technology? Now you might think, and as most people tend to think, that the gadgets are available, we just have to go to the shop and buy them, and if we have money we can do that, and that is all the transaction is, that transaction is all that is required, and then all of us can use these technologies, like let's say the smartphone and laptops and so on. But is there a ghost in the machine behind this large scale production and making us believe that we need to use these? Is it that even in these contexts of just picking up a smartphone and using it, can we still continue with the belief that humans are the ghosts in the machine as controlling how we use that technology and so on? So how do we respond to these kinds of questions? So I'll try and be very brief, but I want to set out a simple argument. So try and see if we can make sense of it. So the first point I want to begin with is the way in which we talk about technology captures this idea of agency. What is that? We often say that technology is a tool used by humans for whatever end goals. It is a tool, and tool has actually, very interestingly, the word tool has very different, many meanings. We tend to use the word, when we say technology is a tool, that it is something available to us and for us to use in whichever way we want. We are using this term as a word, the similar word which would be right here is tool as a pawn. Technology is a pawn, the pawn is something under our control, whom I can manipulate and make it do what I want. And this is such a dominant meaning on technology. I see this across students. You see that when I talk to engineering students who have so much of influence on what technology is being produced, they still tend to look at technology as a tool which is under our control and usable by us. But the word tool itself is very interesting because there are actually different meanings of it, and they all manifest as different types of technologies. For example, very simple set of meanings which you'll see from a dictionary would be a device. The other words for tool would be device, an instrument, an implement, a gadget like I've been talking about, something which is an accessory to something else, a contraption which is to suggest various things are put together and you have some vague thing which you have, an appendix, something which is added to something else, and so on. So you can see in all of this, even when you say that it is a tool with all these different meanings, then you can ask these very simple questions about what is this tool all about? And here is where the relation between technology and the human body we can see as a long historical trajectory. Now, we know so many examples of technology. So I want to try and, for certain levels of clarity, I'll try and break it up into three parts, at least three types of technologies which distinguish the way they actually work. So I want to call them as assist. So three types are assist, enhance and replace. So these are the three functions of technological gadgets, or whatever you call as machines, which is one set of group of machines or gadgets assist something. The others enhance certain qualities. Let's talk about the human body. So one set of technologies could be are things which assist you to do certain things. I'm not able to lift, let's say, a huge, very heavy stone. I can use a particular kind of a technology, let's say a pulley system, to help me pull it out. And that technology is used to assist certain bodily functions. It can also enhance it. There are various ways of enhancing various kinds of, basic bodily qualities. For example, including, eyesight, what you do with, different kinds of, eye technologies, optical technologies. And third, replace. So let's use this as very broad categories of ways of recognizing what different types of technologies are, each one of them are. So when we say technology is a tool, then I just want to point out that under each of them, whether they do the function of assistance or the function of enhancement or replacement, the nature of the tool is changed. It is not, so in other words, to say that a computer is the same as a hammer would be wrong, because the kinds of functions, although they're all technologies and machines, the kind of functions and what they eventually do to the human body and the mind, etc., actually make them very different types, very different kinds of technologies. Now, if we look at technologies in these three types of parts, just for us to start thinking about it, assistance, enhancing and replacement, then you can ask, assist what? Replace what? And here again, just for simple typology so that we have some clarity in thinking, you could say, well, one is it assists, enhances and replaces structures of the body, elements of the body. That's a very first important element of technology. There are most of the examples we have used in early technologies are something to help the body do something, including early agricultural technologies of plow, and you make these iron plows, etc., to till the land and so on. They were all doing certain kinds of enhancement, assistance to the body, not really replacement there. But it's not just the body. when as technology grows, there are other kinds of things which happen. For example, it also does assist, enhance and replaces nature. When we say nature here, I mean it as a term which covers a lot of types of elements which belong to nature, including the forces of nature. When it comes to nature, along with this others, you could also add another very important part, which is what defines what we would call as modern technology, which is it assists, enhances, replaces and controls nature. A large amount of technologies which are produced were attempts to control certain, quote unquote, forces of nature. Whether it's the dam or whether it's any of the other kinds of structures you produce, in order to find some kind of control of nature around you. So there are some very, of course, very interesting discussions on how you would use technologies, including basic, landscaping technologies to replace or control the wilderness within society. So civilizing a society, producing a city, for example, or a town, meant cleaning it out of the wilderness of nature, so that it's not a forest which is uncontrolled. So you produce very controlled gardens and so on. So all of these are very deeply related to the questions of control. Now, body and nature is one simple, obvious example we know of, early examples of technology. But what is very important to recognize is today's technology does the same thing with two other things. One is, it is also about enhancing, controlling and replacing social characteristics. I don't want to say society, but let's say the social in a larger sense. So enhance, control and replace social relationships, social conditions, the way in which society is organized and so on. We'll just talk very briefly about some examples of all of this. And finally, that particular technologies which seem to bother a lot of people today it is also about assisting, enhancing, controlling and replacing the functions of the human mind. And that's really what is happening in context of artificial intelligence. A lot of the early digital technologies are already involved in doing that, replacing for example, the famous chess player Gary Kasparov in his book Deep Thinking calls as menial mental tasks, like basic things like remembering, calculating, etc. are all being replaced in various ways by the machine rather than by the human mind. So in each of these examples, in each of these types, assist, enhance, replace and control, they are doing it for different things. One for the body, one for nature, one for the social world, and the last one is this so-called control of the various questions to do with the mental states or cognitive states, if you want a larger framework for that. But the crucial point we have to ask is this thing. How do we think about the nature of a tool? What is it to say other than saying, look, I have a knife, I use it to cut vegetables, I use it to kill people. I mean, this is I must have heard this example about 1 million times from my, earliest times of talking about philosophy of science and technology. That these are all value neutral objects, and that therefore how people use it is what defines the meaning of that object. So the objects by themselves do not have any ordained meaning. So this is a very classic example of saying technology is a tool and under control of humans. But for us to analyze this, let me phrase a series of questions about the nature of a tool. So when we talk about a tool, let's assume technology is a tool. So for this purpose of today's talk, to understand the nature of agency, I will accept that technology is a tool. Then the first question I'll ask is, for what? Tool for what? Because I know if I have a hammer as a tool, I know it is for breaking something. I have a screwdriver as a tool, I know it is for opening up certain things, etc. So obviously, tools are defined for what purposes they may have been thought of, imagined, produced, etc. But second, as important as that, is to ask, tool for whom? Because when we try to remove the idea of technology away from human production, from human relationship with it, just like we do to nature. So remember that one of the ways by which modern science begins, which is very important, is to distinguish the relationship between humans and the natural world which is given. So the task of science is to discover the elements of what nature is, or if you want to call it truths of nature or whatever, right? So similarly, this art. So one might say, well, this is obvious. If you do that for science, you do that for technology too. But there's a very big distinction between it. If you look at history of technology, the relationship between science and technology is actually quite tenuous. It is not at all strong. There are very many interesting questions of what came first, what drives, whether technology has produced many examples of scientific theories and scientific ideas, and on the other hand, science also uses technology to legitimize what it does, because you say this idea is correct because it produces a technology and so on. So there's a one-to-one relationship between science and technology has been much analyzed and understood and discussed now within these fields. But I think one distinction we have to accept is that even if it is correct that science wants to look at nature as something different from humans, and it's able to understand and analyze the truth of nature, so let's assume that it is true, but for technology that cannot be, and therefore you have to understand it as a social production. In fact, I would argue that a lot of science is also cannot be understood by removing the social from science, but that's a different topic altogether. But I'm saying in technology we cannot do it. So therefore the question of what, whether, for whom, for what, etc. Should be understood from its relationship with human societies, from its relationship to how these societies are structured, who is thinking on our behalf, who is producing these technologies on our behalf, and so on. So, just to give you very specific examples, if you ask the question, what drives technology? So, it's part of the question of who is producing it for what purposes. If you look at over history, there have been various influences. You had the early examples of agriculture, which made the first examples of plows. For example, for those of who know about the enormous amount of interesting metallurgical processes which was done in ancient India, for example, the famous ukku, the steel making processes, the famous alloy making process, which were all very, very advanced in terms of their capacity to produce those objects, because it's very difficult to make alloys. For example, zinc distillation is a very difficult process and so on. But this was being done not by a very high level knowledge community. It was being done at very different levels of society. For example, the blacksmiths were our most important scientists and technocrats of these times when they produced these alloys and the famous the ukku, the steel making examples, which many have talked about. Similarly, so too in China. So agriculture was very important. In the context of alloy, what is very interesting in the Indian context is because a lot of idols are being made with these different alloys, that also drove a lot of kind of innovation and doing of these technologies in producing these alloys. Similarly, you also had a lot of new technologies, gadgets coming up for the context of exploration. In fact, again, Asia and Africa, which are the pioneers in a lot of the early technologies, produce some of the most important technological gadgets related to ship navigation. So they could move across the seas for trade and for conquest, of course, through these kinds of technologies, including shipping technologies, which are very, very fascinating. There are wonderful stories around it. Okay, so but that was the question of what and who in very early technologies. But as the history of technology came towards our modernity and etc. Today, if you really look at what really drives technology, the greatest, most important reason which drives technology is war and defense. If you look at just the basic list of technologies which are produced through war efforts, not just by research for war weapons, okay, which is now one of the largest amount of money spent, even in terms of support for science also, where if you ask where does the money come from, a very disproportionate amount comes from military and defense efforts. But more than that, forget about the machine, all the bombs they're making, that's not the question at all. Almost all our everyday technologies, including the smartphone, in every smartphone that we use, is a product of what has been produced in wars, both in terms of how it helped them conduct the war, and secondly also in terms of learning from how it failed or succeeded in war. So this is something which we need to acknowledge, and then see what we do with it. For example, just to give a very quick run through, and these are very common, you can find this in so many places and discussion in the public space. Radar, the internet that you're using, the GPS, without which nobody drives on Indian streets today, the duct tape, microwave ovens, engines, freeze drying, frozen June concentrate, drones, of course all the jet packs and so on, blood transfusion, blood banks, stainless steel, etc., tea bag, including things like tea bags, synthetic rubber, night vision, digital cameras, etc., etc. Okay, so much of course computers, the digital technology. All of them are actually byproducts of something else, some other human social activity. Now, it is quite different from the way in which early technologies were produced and the context in which they were produced. Similarly, while trade is probably the oldest human profession, obviously in terms of transactions, trade today is so much, has produced so much of technologies in terms of what is called fintechs, just so as to support something. What is it to support? It's to support global banking, global markets, notions of global profit making, etc. Has actually, we think of it as something which is happening within the financial sector, or some economists would say, let's do it this way. But no, it is only made possible by particular technology. So production of these technologies become very fundamental to the way in which you produce these things. Another example which many case studies people talk about, for example, in the early times of internet, one of the most important drivers of internet, that which produced so many of these applications in internet, which makes it so easy for us to use email or for me to do this YouTube talk, was actually driven by pornography. Because that pornography actually drove so much of technology in the internet domain, because it allowed, it does many things, and that's again something which we can talk about later, because it also did something very important to the idea of technology, which we do not think about when we don't think about it as a very functional thing, like in banking or sending emails and so on. Because with technology associated with pornography, what it showed is that the idea of technology is fundamentally an idea of desire. And if there is a problem of agency, the question of agency in technology, it does come back to the question of the problem of human desire and what is desire, etc. So now, once you have this idea of the what, then you have to ask a very fundamental who question. Who decides what should be enhanced and replaced? So let us accept that we need these machines or gadgets to enhance and assist and enhance and replace, etc. Fine. But who decides what should be enhanced and replaced? How is this process of decision done? Who should decide what should be enhanced and assisted and replaced in the society? What kind of technologies have we produced to replace poverty in society? We have done today's technological world is so advanced in so many different ways, including with the AI, the digital world, and we have all kinds of social relationships have been replaced completely. But why is it that one does not think, what does this global world which produces this technology, the so-called humans who control technology, haven't thought that introducing technologies to eradicate poverty, to produce a sense of empathy, to produce a sense of fraternity in society, should be a fundamental function of technology? Why would we not even, who decides on this? So this question of the who is extremely important, and here is where our modern technologies are fundamentally different from ancient technologies. I get really irritated sometimes when people keep telling me, when we talk about smartphones. Sorry? Hello, can you hear me? Example, and they'll say, all of you, they'll say every time a new technology came, people complain. When knife came, people complain. When printing press came, they complain. So also when the digital world come, they are complaining. But there is a particular fundamental difference in the nature of a knife and the nature of the digital technologies. I'll just give you one example. Just to, I'll give you an example back from after saying this particular thing. Okay, so we'll see how to connect it. So this question of what is the difference between, let's say, a knife and a computer or a smartphone, is related to this very simple question: for whom is technology produced? So for who are supposed to be the users of technology? Is it meant for individuals? Is it meant for all individuals? Is it actually meant for the poor, for the disenfranchised? Is it who actually, we realize that we are the consumers of it, but we are not technology users as much as we are consumers. And this is the basic question which we need to talk about. And this is where there is a fundamental difference between, this question of knife and the digital technologies, because early technologies, the function of early technologies was not an individual. Individuals were part of the use of technology, but they had a social character. I often think the best example is, look at a technology like railway technology, which people said revolutionized India, for example, in various ways. Okay, even the British thought it's going to revolutionize various things. A railway train is a fantastic example of a technology which is socially mediated. When I want to travel on the train, I'm traveling with 1,000 other people. I mean, look at the most amazing aspect of a train. When sleeping is such a personal act and we never want to sleep with others, even in the same room, even in a hotel. Here we are, 1,000 strangers, men and women and children, all sleeping on the same machine, which goes through the night. This idea that the train is not mine, that I have to get onto the train at the same time that all of you get onto it, we all have to leave at the same time, and I can't do what I want with the train based on my interest or my whatever I think of it, is a very important aspect of the fact that technologies produced a social world. When we went to a movie earlier, it was at 3:30 in the afternoon show, means all of us have to wait at 3:30. And we all enter in at 3:30 and watch the movie. I can't fast forward it, I can't just cut this and you watch that, I watch it. The notion of the individual, which seems to have produced what these digital technologies do today, is not a fundamental characteristic of those technologies, which means that relationship actually regulated technology. The very fact of this social relationship moderates and mediates and regulates the power of technology, even within, for example, the railways, etc., etc. So, if you ask a question for whom was a train produced, the train is not produced for you and me as individuals. It's produced for a community. It's produced for certain kinds of social actions. Now, even those technologies, while they were done for that, did have purpose, including maybe profit making, some amount of it, etc. But this notions of this constant understanding that technology is not something outside the humans was actually regulated all these earning technologies. But if you look at today's technology, this is the last point I'll make to connect you to what is this question of agency. If you look at this question about what is happening today, we have, for example, smartphones which have gone so deeply into people's world in such a short time. No time in the history of the world has any introduction of any new technology had such a major social change like these smartphones have done just in the last few years. You see everywhere out on the road, you travel on the train, you walk on the streets, you sit in a classroom. Even when I'm teaching in class, you'll have students sitting with these phones. It's impossible for us to be able to stop using phone. And if you really follow what is happening, we see that the way in which we are engaging with these technologies produces deep anxiety and angst, and enormous amount of anxiety if you don't have it within you. It is also, and if you look at the various apps within it, it is produced for very particular purposes. For example, the Swiggy and other apps which have become so popular today, they were actually produced not by thinking of all the individuals, all the so-called individuals and humans within India or Asia and Africa. It's produced for an aging European society, an aging society where you do not have young labor. Whereas what you have in India is one of the world's largest youth labor, and we also have the largest unskilled labor. By 2030, it is projected that 70% of our youth labor are going to be unskilled. And while the whole world has moved from blue collar to white collar jobs, we are going to be producing enormous amount of these people. Even I say this today, it doesn't have to be some economical statistics. Around in Bangalore, for example, the number of young people who are doing just the service sector, just driving Ola, Uber, cab, bringing Swiggy and Zomato and delivering food in people's home is just astounding. The last enormous number of people, what is going to happen to them? And we think it is something which is, this technology has enabled it in some sense. So we need to understand what is this question of agency here then. Because when we say it is humans who control technology, then the question is very simple. Who is the human who is controlling the technology? Is it you who is controlling it? Am I controlling the technology? Is it a group of us? That all of us in this conference will suddenly say, we are the people who control technology? Where is this invisible group that controls technology? And this is a fundamental problem because it comes down to this question of agency. Because the argument that humans ultimately control technology, is fallacious because even parents don't have control over young children's demand for example, for the smartphone. As a teacher, how many times, I'm sure many of you have had this experience, I have had this experience of parents coming and saying, what do I do? I don't know what to do when our children say they are not going to, they have no communication with us, they are completely within this machine. Completely, because we have produced a kind of an entitled, embodied individual within that particular machine. So even parents don't have control over 2-year and 3-year-old children's demand. Then what is the question of agency? Who has the agency? How do we rethink this question of agency? And remember that for me, the really worrying question, especially definitely to groups like yours who know the importance of revolution and protest and so on, is that technological dependence of this kind decreases our capacity to be agents. And I can tell you hundreds of these. Every day in Bangalore is a mess. Every road in Bangalore is broken up. And yet, everybody goes silently through all the potholes, through all the dug up stuff. Every day they complain, auto drivers, car drivers, everybody who is driving is going to complain. In motorbikes is more dangerous. But nothing is done because the technology which is producing it, because they're building metro or roads or whatever, are those in which we have no agency. And most recently, 2 weeks back, I was in Thrissur and we were going from the Cochin airport to Thrissur, and that road, which I'm sure all of you know very well, is as bad a mess as Bangalore roads are. And the funny thing is, it took so long to travel that road, and the person who was driving me he's also a cab driver, so he was saying he does it so many times a day, and he says everything is gone, his vehicle is spoiled, his back is gone, and he says it is like this. And I told him, I'm surprised, for the last so many months it is in a place like Kerala, where people have just not, they have nothing to say about it. We just do it. He said all of us just come, sit, know this and we do it. It is not as much as saying about us as it is saying about that particular technology in which none of us have a say, none of us have an agency, because we think that's a major project. We don't know how to make this concrete and build these flyovers and stuff. We can't fix a single thing because increasingly this notion of technological dependence on the most basic thing decreases our most basic sense of agency. In fact, when in smartphone, many of you would know, of course, 20 years back we remembered our addresses, our phone numbers and other people's phone numbers and so on. Today you ask anybody around you how many phone numbers they remember. Somebody was telling me as a joke, but I think it was not a joke because it was almost very close to the truth, when he said, sometimes I feel like I'll have to go back to my phone to ask the phone what is my name. Because we don't know our addresses, where to go, what to go. Everything which we knew, which we acted as an agential agent, which is saying decision to do something, we don't do it because we look at the phone. We drive, we don't take cognizance of the world around us, how to go, how to plan the map, because I just follow the GPS or whatever the thing which shows me how to go. So therefore, the question about the fact that we tend to have agency is something we need to really relook at, and and I think if we really look at the question of the impact it has had, particularly on children and the young students, it is so devastating. that today one of the most growing so-called disorders has to do with psychological disorders leading to this. In all this case, people would say that we have become addicted to phones, and net addiction and phone addiction is so much a part of medicalization today. So in this sense, you could say we are like alcoholics. We deny our addiction, but get completely flustered and uncontrollable if our access to these gadgets or if the email stops working for a day. And in this case, remember that the word addiction is very closely related to the idea of loss of agency. Because, of course, we know earlier on that a lot of factory-produced food, including soft drinks and these chips and so on, we have heard stories of how they put certain chemicals so as to make children get more addicted to that. Now, if we think that companies who produce these smartphones and AI are not adding addictive agents in technology to make us so dependent on them, then I think we will be slightly mistaken. And therefore, the one way out, and this will be the last point, and we'll just try and stop here, which is to say that we have to then now begin to accept something which people in technology studies have been saying for quite some time, which is to say, let us not hide under this myth that we have control over technology today, because we don't know who is doing it, what is doing it. It is so distributed and so hidden. We have very little clue, but it's changing each one of our lives, from the smallest villages to the biggest city, in very drastic ways. And one of the ways which we would try to understand technology was to say that give agency to the material object itself. That technological objects have a particular agential sense, just like we think we have some agential power. So if you do that, we begin to look at these objects in a slightly different way. And therefore this leads to very interesting questions of how to deal with it, especially when today's technology is producing not just anti-social, it has produced a completely anonymous social. I've heard of people, and I'm sure some of you would know, this was told to me by somebody who teaches in a very prominent institution in India today. He said that he still today he has to teach class on the online. It's a hybrid mode. He says students can come to my class, okay, they can sit in my hostel and listen to it, and it's a regular classes. And I said, how does this government institute even allow it, such a prestigious institute? And he said, it's because the students told the institute that they cannot sit with others, they cannot handle being in the presence of others, and therefore you produce these great tech minds who are actually so antisocial. They're going to sit in their room, learn what is to be done, and I don't know how they become citizens in a world, how do they understand basic social values, etc. So the final point, therefore, which makes us maybe think a little bit about all this, is to go back to the question, who controls this production of these, not just the gadgets, that is okay. We know, Nokia is producing it, or China is producing chips and so on. I mean, all that is not the factories which are producing it. That who controls all the desires and the imagination? Whose desires and imagination has become our fate? That we all think that these technology is indispensable and we have to live with it, and that we have to use it because it is given to us. Under whose dictates are we as a social group with so much of notions of freedom in it still caught within it and unable to come out of it and being driven more and more deeper into it? I'll stop here, not to leave this on a very troubling note about what technology is, but actually to hopefully actually suggest to us that, look, there are ways by which we should think through this far more deeply, and that has to be done as a community process. People from different backgrounds and different disciplines, etc., have to really come together to take agency back in our hands, to imagine what kind of technology we would need. And when we say we have to know who is this we talk about, whose we do we begin with, and that's our starting point of trying to think through the relationship between technology and agency. Thank you so much for sitting through this topic. Sorry, I missed you all.
Something which we have been engaged for. So now I would like to add one or two things in the form of queries or questions or etc. Which is that one is regarding, you started off with Descartes and how the question of body and mind actually, there was a mind-body issue which was begun by Descartes and has continued even now, which is very important. And one of the reasons why we have got this problem today regarding the agencies, I think primarily because of the fact that we are stuck with the same problem. In the sense that, when we act as human beings, and as you said yourself, we are actually making technology as tools. But at the same time, we are supposed to be actually humans who are using your mind to control technology. Supposing that your mind is replaced, let us say through a neural organism, your language, for example, or your mathematics, for example, your language, your mathematics, your neural organism, everything is being replaced. Naturally, this question of mind-body dualism is something that becomes problematic today, because that Cartesian dualism sort of disappears in one way. That is one thing. But if once that takes place, the entire thing about agency which you are talking about actually had accept that mind still separate, whether it is in the form of reason or rationality, or whether it is instrumental or otherwise rationality. This is something that is separate, and it will be able to solve the questions that have been posed by technology, whether it is creative or destructive. So when you have got a war, let us say, you have talked about war being the most crucial, which I agree with you. But the point is that when war is no longer a war of the earlier times, when you have got war is accompanied by conquest. Now war is something very, very different. The type of war which they do in Gaza or Lebanon and Ukraine are very different from the type of war which used to be during the Second World War, etc. So which means that you have got a very curious situation whereby the original Cartesian dualism is actually obliterated for something else. We don't know what that something else is. That at least I don't know what that something else is even now. But then also, which also means that the question of agency becomes a kind of situation where technology becomes a kind of techno-fetish, which actually acts upon human beings indirectly, instead of human beings acting upon the technology. If that is so, then we are into a very serious situation as far as humanity is concerned. And that is my one. The second thing is that, which also leads to the second issue, which is that, you see, this whole question about, you talked about technology being used as a tool. At the same time, you said that technology could be used to kill as well as create. You can produce with technology as well as kill with technology. The same knife can be used for both. So if that is so, when, for example, when technology is therefore linked with power, then what happens is that the very aspect of technology no longer is production or creativity or innovation. It is something that See, if that is so, See, when you control people, when you try to decide, you talked about desire, you actually engage them and you actually drive the desire yourself, whoever is the agency. You produce desire. As you talked about pornography, you produce desire. Then what happens is that you have got a situation where the relationship between labor and technology, which used to be our major standpoint for a very long time. Marx, in fact, talked about organic body and inorganic body, where inorganic body, technology becoming an extension, a kind of augmentation of human labor power. Now we have got a situation, this augmentation does not take place anymore, because human labor power probably is reduced to making chips and tools and other things somewhere, and the other things, the software is actually made by somewhere else. So you have got a situation where again another kind of separation or complete alienation of labor power from technology is something that is taking place today, when labor is replaced or labor is just allowed to die on its own. Is that so? These are two questions which I am trying to raise. I am just trying to raise it without, I am not asking any question or anything, just trying to raise it. That's all. Thank you very much.
Actually, I'll start with the second one. It's a very important point you made, which I'll just say a little bit about. And this distinction, the Marxian distinction between the inorganic and the organic body, which you very nicely said. Now, I think what is happening with earlier factory technologies, yes, you could still make a distinction between who is a laborer, who is a factory worker, and what is the technological gadget in a factory. But what is happening with this particular situation today is that modern labor are actually being converted to completely being inorganic bodies. And the way that is happening is quite shocking, because it is no longer like an appendage. What is happening is every part of our body is being replaced. And the replacement is not necessarily like the pacemaker or heart lung. I'm not talking about that. The first example, 20 years back when I was in Bangalore, the National Institute of Advanced Studies, we had a talk by a person who came from Britain, and he called himself the first cyborg. And what he did was to show how he had implanted a chip inside him. And by implanting a chip inside him, he demonstrated it actually sitting in Bangalore. He could operate an instrument in an apartment in New York, because by various commands or movement of his body, it sends signals which connected to the internet, and through the internet it goes there. Today we know that it's so common that I know people who come from the US operate everything in their house from their phone here. They can close the door, open the door, put on the lights, check this, check that, and so on. So what is happening is this, and this is definitely going to happen. It's not some science fiction fantasy, that our replacement of our capacities, including our capacity to decision make, take a particular, be agential in a particular way, will be replaced by inorganic elements like your chips and other kinds of devices. So we're going to be, the devices which are outside us, which are appendages, are going to go inside us. So this new labor which is being produced, this very insightful point by Marx, is that it's going to produce a completely inorganic body, and therefore this question of who is the human, what is the status of the human, it's the state, the future of the human, both the human body as well as anything that characterizes us humans. And how do we now respond to this question, right? And that's this constant belief. I think there's a lot of escapism when we say that we have control at some level. Humans still, when I talk to many of the IT people, they say, we only do the coding, and if we don't do the coding, how will machines run? So we are the ones who are running the machines. And they were saying this just till 1 month back, before they heard that all the coding jobs are now gone. We don't need these people to do the coding to do anymore, because coding is the biggest loss of IT jobs right now. And people who went to study thinking they're going to get jobs in coding are now slowly realizing that they don't need them at all. So what I'm trying to say is, how do we make people recognize this larger question of asking how do we recapture our agency of just being ourselves? Because as you very correctly said, the techno fetish is, it has just taken over defining who we are. Why is it that there is so much of psychological struggle and pain among the youth, and I find that the most difficult thing to see. The alienation, the social alienation is so large within families, within friends, that it is redefining the nature of social relationships. And so both at the social level of labor and at the house level of labor, we are seeing enormous impact. So yeah, I really wish that, people like you and this particular kinds of organizations really come back and relook at these questions more seriously and in a more social manner, bringing people together to think through these questions.
I agree with you there, and but still I would like to ask this whole problem about the first question which I raised. I'm sorry, I asked about the first question which you raised, because which I raised, because we have been into this whole problem about our capacity for reasoning as a very important thing which separates us from technology, in one sense. But this has been seriously questioned during the 20th century itself, because from the beginning of 20th century, we have gone into a large number of unreason, a number of places where whole thing has changed completely. But the point here which I am trying to raise is that once this kind of a differentiation which you are actually experiencing is happening, then how do you think? I mean, when you talk about agency, there seems to be, at least from the point of pure control over the entire ICT field, at least, there seems to be an agency which seems to be functional in the sense of a few multinational conglomerates which seems to be functional, and which seems to have taken over practically everything, including all the important persons. Everyone has been taken over by them, including the client. They have been taken over. Now, how do you visualize a kind of a commons? There was people in Negri was talking about commons, and now how do you visualize? Is there a possibility of a commons emerging from the same system which you are talking? Is there a possibility, or do you have to live with individualization alone?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So no, I think this is the fundamental question. I'm sorry I missed answering that. I'm very hopeful for a variety of reasons. Look at what the technology people themselves did, like Zuckerberg, or I'm sure Musk at one level and others. What they did is, for example, the famous example of Zuckerberg, who said he never lets his children use these technologies because he knows very well when thousands of these people who started AI from Google and OpenAI, etc., wrote the letter of protest saying that they are very deeply worried about what is going to happen to the world. It is they who know, because they have produced it and they know the impact of it. And they are very concerned about it, and they wrote this letter of protest about it, right? So you will actually see there are groups now which are actually raising these questions and also refusing to engage with it. So one of the ways of doing this is to be able to refuse to engage with it. I think the real problem is our capacity to engage with the public on it. Because this sense of desire which is produced makes people think that this is the only way out. So there are two things: one, desire and inevitability, right? They feel that, oh, if I don't use it, there's no way I can survive in this world. And it is true. For a long time, I never used these phones till I realized that all my banking were all shifted to the phones. You need to have a phone to do it. Today in Bangalore, I used to use a button phone, and I realized I can't get any more autos on the street because there are no autos on the street. Everything is through Uber and Ola, etc. Which means that you need to have even payment. Now, After that step of getting Uber and Ola on the phone, then you realize I used to carry money and now I've stopped carrying money because nobody carries money and they don't give you change. So it is a way by which a larger political structure is also pushing us towards it. So that is one kind of a struggle. The other struggle is actually much more important on how we talk to people about this. How do we make them realize that these kinds of protections of desires, etc., have to be re-looked at in a different way. A very quick point about this is the fact that our narrative about what is achievement, what is success, and what is desire, or what is desirous, has been produced with a very capitalist economy. It is only, you think that somebody refusing to buy something, or somebody refusing to buy a very fancy car, or build this very fancy house, or live in a fancy house in Bangalore, or buy fancy clothes, etc., are actually, there is something wrong. They are either poor or not capable, etc. The act of voluntarily giving up, which is one of the most important definitions of any revolutionary movement, whether it's Gandhi or anybody else, the act of voluntarily saying, I do not want this, even though this may be seen as a particular kind of a social status, is a very important aspect of how we build a society. In other words, the question we have to ask is, how do we make people recognize that buying into this extremely consumerist, the worldview, extreme levels of consumerist worldview, is actually not about having success or enforcing their autonomy, because we have reduced autonomy to choice of objects, choice of how many cars you want, rather than reflect upon the very simple fundamental nature of what constitutes autonomy and what constitutes voluntarily. The greatest notions of our agency comes when I voluntarily give up what others think I should have for my social status. How do we do that as a community? Especially, Kerala is an exception, but in other parts of the country where it's so difficult to even have other political movements which can raise these questions or talk about them. How do we actually do it? I think that remains a very important open question.
Lecture, if there are anybody else who is
Any questions, sir?
somebody is asking you.
Hello. Hello. Hi, sir. Can you hear me? See me? Yes. Can you hear, sir? Okay. Is it better? Yeah. Okay. Good evening. Good evening, sir. Yeah, I think there's a bit of an echo. I was one of your students from MCPH, first batch of interns, long time back. So it's really nice to hear you talk. And I just had a couple of questions. So when we talk about the community and the individual, what about ChatGPT AI, right? Like, was it designed with a community in mind? Because personally, I've been using it to replace my therapist, The amount of empathy that ChatGPT kind of maybe presents itself as having, the agential question, I think, works both ways. Like, I stop talking to it and sometimes feel like, oh, am I ignoring a real person, right? And it's really interesting because in New York, like now a judge passed this law, and all our data is actually being stored. So unlike a conventional therapy session, for example, where your privacy is a given thing, it's not even true, right? So what do you think about that like how safe is it, or rather what should be the thinking around like confiding in AI to that extent. And a note on the labor thing that you were discussing earlier. I don't think we can speak about labor without speaking about women's labor. And we really have to see how much of technology has really replaced, what do you say, you might have the baby monitor, but have you really redone cooking, for example, conventional roles associated with women, or reproduction, for example. And again, if Descartes was a man, just for your humor, the thing that we experience as premenstrual rage, for example, right? That would be a ghost in the machine, I would say, because I don't think I am in charge. The anger and the feelings, they just come and take over. So when you were talking about that, it just got me thinking about at those particular moments of kind of takeover of the cognizant mind, like the feelings come from somewhere completely unexplainable, not as responses to what's going on in the environment. You would think that the mind-body divide, that's another way of looking at how it might not make sense. I don't know if it's already there's feminist work on this, but I thought it might be something that you might that I should say here. So yeah. Thank you so much, sir, for your very, very, very enlightening conversation as usual.
Pleasure to see you back here, and thank you for your questions. Okay, there are very quickly, the first point I want to point out is something which I've been saying for the last 30 years, but obviously it's very difficult to make the point in sometimes in Indian context. The first point is that technological gadgets are not culture free. They are intrinsically historical, social, cultural entities. The amount of claims that that's why I said about this thing about the parallel between science and technology is that if you think science is about nature which is outside humans, it removes the humans from description of the nature, and that's the fundamental origin of modern science. If you make the same mistake with technology, that has far greater impact. Science is at least a discourse, and that we can work with it in some sense. But if technology has immediate impacts on our everyday life, so the culture of technology means that how do you produce technology which is sensitive to your cultural needs in some sense. The example which I said about Swiggy and other things arose because, how do you take care of an aging population where there is no labor to actually, or people are not able to go out and shop. So you need to produce these kinds of gadgets which will replace certain kinds of labor, right? In the same way, including the question of ChatGPT and therapy is also related to the question of cultural forms of being with each other. I'm not saying that there are various other examples. To go back to Professor Ganesh's point about Descartes also, is that what is very interesting is Descartian model, which is so influential to all of us today, comes from a particular theological tradition in Europe, given for his particular, whatever his concerns were. But what is ironic is, remaining 90 or 95% of the world, including all over Asia and Africa, the mind-body distinction in the most rigorous philosophical traditions like Buddhism, Jainism, or various other kinds of philosophical, Chinese, the Japanese, do not accept that the mind and body are distinct in kind, like the Descartian. But this Descartian fallacy is central to our educational system, to the extent that all our classes, look at what we do in our education, we sit in classrooms, we take children and dump them in classrooms and make them sit for 8 hours, thinking that education is about training the mind, whatever that thing called mind is, decoupling it from the physical body, which needs to go out, sit out, jump, walk, talk, laugh. That is part of learning, right? So, part of our erasure of learning to respond to people around us, to respond to the African and Asian cultures, rather than looking at just 2 or 3 of people who have written about something in the world, has actually led to this particular problem. So the point about ChatGPT question is also about what kind of cultures of listening and hearing were present. And like in Norway, in Scandinavian countries where there was no young labor and you needed people to do the menial task, so too this question of community listening, community sharing, community groups, people where they will be listening to you, talking with you, living with you. the nature of friendship, which was so unique and central to various Indian communities, have all had, I'm not saying for good or bad, but have been replaced by the kind of definitions of friendship and individual which drives these technologies from some societies. It is very ironic, which is this something which I often find really sometimes difficult to digest. The imagination behind many of our digital technologies come from American teenagers sitting there and thinking this is the way the world is going to be, and they produce these machines and all of us are caught within it. So there are very important functions of this ChatGPT therapy. This is the point about technology can never be always bad or always good. That is the nature of that. It's a question of how much we have control, or what as Professor Ganesh was also saying, how much we allow it to control us in some sense. Therefore, once a question of culture, of course, includes a question of women. There's been a lot of very interesting work on this, of course, on the impact on women's labor, etc. But this is the very ironic part, right? So within societies for which this technology is designed, women are not doing the kind of labor that they are doing in our societies, like in the famous Malayalam film, The Great Indian Kitchen. So these technologies are actually reflecting a particular kind of social structure in those particular societies. When you bring it and put it into our kitchens and our worlds, what do they actually produce? Does it actually produce more work for women? Have they actually replaced something, liberated them in other different ways? These are, all I'm saying is rather than taking positions, I'm saying how do we think through these questions? What are the resources we need to be able to collectively reflect on this? So I'm just going to leave that slightly open because these are very deep questions. But I hope this will open up various ways of thinking through within individuals and as a group. Thank you.
I think we are past our time. I think now it is 6 o'clock. You have actually opened up a very important area of debate within Kerala society, primarily because of the fact that it's my personal opinion, not necessarily that of the organizers or any, which is that in Kerala at least, despite the fact that Kerala has got more better opportunities for actually making the technology essential, what happens is that we seem to have sort of sunk knee deep into technology, not knee deep, sunk the whole thing into technology. And as a result, what seems to be happening is today is that the type of individualism which you are talking about, which is essentially linked in Kerala, I'm not sure about other places, is also with consumerism, which you are pointing out. But Kerala is basically a consumer state, and as a result, individualism is consumerism, and the gadgetry itself is actually feeding into this consumption. Is substantially feeding into this consumption. So we are into a situation where this whole debate on agency will have to be started all over again in Kerala, and we only hope that scholars like you can assist us in whatever way in actually continuing this debate, which we're trying to do, but it has got its own difficulties. The technology people are very strong as far as we are concerned. Not a social scientist or even scientists. So that is very strong. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this thing. And you can find it. Thank you very much.